Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast, where it's all about turning your job search into a slam dunk. Your host is Angela Copeland.
Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Angela Copeland. Live on the phone with me today, I have Rich Jones in San Francisco, California. Rich is a technical recruiter at a large .com company. He's a certified professional in human resources with over 7 years of recruiter and HR experience. Rich also co-hosts the Paychecks and Balances podcast. Paychecks and Balances is a fun-formative podcast covering work and money for the rising professional. Rich, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's so good to talk to you. We met, I think it was a year ago at Podcast Movement. And Back then, I think you were working on a different podcast.
Yeah. I had another podcast that's still active called Two Guys, One Show. It's kind of a lighthearted podcast where we talk about whatever's on our mind, whatever we find interesting and relevant, and took that experience to help start Paychecks and Balances. So when I was at Podcast Movement last year, Paychecks and Balances didn't even exist yet.
Oh, that's great. Well, so what got you interested to start your new podcast about sort of more work and money?
Yeah, there are a lot of millennials out there who've been working for years that don't know how to effectively manage their money or their career. And so with my co-host getting out of $30,000 of credit card debt, I've been working in HR for several years now. Starting a show like ours just made sense. And I think what I found as I was listening to a lot of the podcasts that were out there, I couldn't find something that dealt specifically with work and money that also had a fun approach. And I think a lot of times when it comes to topics like personal finance, career advice, people usually don't find those to be the hottest things out there. Mm-hmm. And so what it takes to reach millennials, especially the millennial group, you need to keep it entertaining. You need to make sure that you can really keep that person's attention. So we bring our full personalities to it. We joke around on it. We have serious discussions, but then we also take that fun, formative approach where we might make some pop culture references to try to drive a point home, or we might tell a story about something that happened when we were trying to save money or get out of debt or trying to find a new job to try to make it more relatable to the listener.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So what episode number are you on?
We are on episode 17. So it's kind of weird. So we have a main episode that we drop every Tuesday. And I think the one that we dropped this past Tuesday was episode 17. But then we also release a QA episode when we get listener questions on work and money. And so I think we've done 8 or 9 of those. So it's probably about closer to 25 to 30 episodes total. I lose track since I'm doing 2 shows, trying to keep track of
I bet.
episodes come out for each.
Well, so since you get all those questions from listeners, what do you think are some of the biggest issues that they're facing when it comes to money?
Well, I've realized that a lot of people, despite having been out of school for a bit and having worked for a few years and being, quote, stable in their career, they still really have no clue how to manage their money, how to balance savings with getting out of debt at the same time. And then you have people who say they want more freedom to be able to take more trips. You have people who say that they want more security in terms of having money saved. So you'll see a lot of articles out there that talk about having 3 to 6 months of income saved. And we get a lot of questions from people like, look, I have a credit card, I have bank accounts. What's the most efficient or what's the most effective way for me to do this or that? And it's been really eye-opening because sometimes you get people who are 30, 40 years old, and we'll say something on the show that we think is really basic or fundamental, and it turns out that's the first time that they heard it, and then that becomes the advice or that becomes the perspective that leads them to take action with whatever it is that they're trying to solve for or whatever the goal is they have professionally or financially.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Do you think that those folks who have the questions, especially the really basic questions, do you think that in their families that finances was a topic, or do you think
Definitely not.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, it's even the same for myself, and I think I was raised pretty well. I think I was a pretty good egg at the end of the day, but we didn't have a lot of conversations about money and how to effectively manage funds. Now, I knew that having a lot of debt was bad,
right.
and that saving money is good, but it wasn't like I had a system that my parents taught me. And it's interesting when I talk to someone that has a really good sense of finance, they usually had a parent that was an accountant, or a parent who really gave them a foundation or a system for how to save money, how to look for bargains, and how to look for deals. And it's even the same thing on the career side. There's someone I work with. Their son is 12 years old, and he was leading like a software engineering workshop. And so his dad's a software engineer. And so the son is already gonna have that foundation because he's grown up in an environment where those types of things were talked about. And for a lot of American families, and probably a lot of homes in general across the world, money sometimes is a taboo topic, and it's not something that people really decide to have an in-depth conversation about. Like, here's how you save. Here's what you should be thinking for a 401k. It's mind-blowing how many people don't even contribute to their 401k at all, and it's basically free money, you know. And so those aren't conversations that a lot of people have when they're growing up.
Yeah, no, you're right. You know, I had a similar experience to what you described in terms of, so I grew up kind of poor, and money was just not something. It was impolite to talk about money. It was very, very impolite. It was considered a very negative thing. And when I got to college, my best friend in college, his father was a chief financial officer for a company. And so it was really normal for them. They talked about money all the time, and he knew tons of stuff about money. And I remember him trying to talk to me about money initially, and I think I got really upset because I was like, you're being very rude. This is impolite. We shouldn't be talking about this. And he eventually convinced me that it was okay to talk about money. And when I started to make money, I was lucky to avoid debt, but I didn't know what to do with that money once I started making it. And I eventually reached out to a financial planner, but I reached out to the kind that you pay on an hourly basis that doesn't take any commission. And they're sort of she's a little more like a financial coach or something. And they teach you sort of that stuff that your parents might have taught you had that been a conversation that you'd had as a kid. And I started working with her maybe 10 years ago, and I went in and said, hey, I know how to make money. I do not know what to do with it now. So, could you help me? And it was life-changing. It really has completely opened my eyes, given me so much more information. So it's really great that you're doing this and that you're helping to educate people, because I do think lots and lots of people miss this message.
Well, so you said something there, though, and this was something I was actually thinking about last night as it relates to some of the projects I'm working on. A lot of people, they're happy to spend money on clothes, food, trips, things to be able to stunt on Instagram or on Facebook and show that they're having the time of their life, but they don't often want to invest in themselves in terms of maybe getting a financial planner or a coach for a few hours. It may seem like a few $100s or whatever it is up front, but it's something that's setting you up for long-term success. And it's the same thing with career advice and career counseling. There are people who will maybe read articles, but they wouldn't entertain the thought of talking to someone who's in the field, who's been working with hiring managers, working with people who've made these career transitions and have made this career progress. They don't want to spend money to talk to someone or maybe even work with a resume writer to come up with a better representation of themselves on paper, on LinkedIn. They won't spend money on that, but they'll happily spend money on some of these other things to be able to keep up with appearances.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think services are so valuable, especially when it's something that you don't already know how to do. Having someone come in and sort of help you beef up in one particular area is so meaningful. And I think, on the financial side, like you said, it impacts you exponentially when it comes to finances. And I mean, a good example on the career coaching side, just for example, is I had a client once who, and not to go off on a tangent, but I did have a client once I met with one time, and I coached them. They already had a job offer, and I coached them on negotiation. It was one hour meeting, and the person negotiated up their salary $10,000. So even though, that 1 hour was a little bit pricey, it definitely wasn't $10,000 pricey.
Yeah.
So it's but it's the same idea when it comes to finances is having that insight. It's so helpful. And you have this person that's like part of your team and that's on your side. But well, so I'd love to jump over to sort of some questions that are more around sort of your HR background and understanding sort of the workplace really, really well. I talk to job seekers a lot, actually. Lately, this has come up more this year than any other year. I talk to job seekers who are really feeling like they're underpaid in their current position, and they want to go and approach their manager and ask for more money for the job that they're already doing. And I'm just wondering if you might have some feedback for us if we're in that situation, we're feeling frustrated. What can we do? What options are there?
Yeah, well, first thing, it's really difficult in most companies to get an off-cycle raise. So if it's March, performance review season has passed, or it's May, and you say, hey, I want more money for the job, it's not likely that's going to happen, given that a lot of the salary increases typically happen during one of the review cycles. So some companies have a mid-year review cycle, and then they also have a end-of-year performance management review cycle, which they look at everything you've done over the past year. A lot of times there's also a self-review that the person will complete. And I'm speaking of this from working with companies that have had some of this stuff in place. The smaller shops, they may not be as elaborate here, and it's more of a conversation. The one thing I do recommend that people do is keep track of all of the things that you've done throughout the year, all of the significant things. So if you sent an email, you don't need to log every single email that you sent. But if you're completing projects, you got praise from someone for something, you went above and beyond, you stayed after and helped on a critical project, it's good to have a place where you have all of that stuff written out. So when it comes time to do your self-evaluation, or it comes time to have that compensation conversation, you can actually reference some of the things that you've done and had an impact on throughout the year. Because even for myself, there were times earlier in my career when I'd go into a performance review conversation and rattle off maybe a couple of the recent things that I'd done, but I'd also forgotten about all of the stuff that I'd done over the previous 10 months. Mm-hmm. And that's not something that you can leave in the hand of your manager either. You can't expect them to remember everything that you've done throughout the year. Because they're probably managing other people who are doing a bunch of things. And of course, they're also thinking about their own individual performance. But when you have that concrete information, that data, as we like to refer to out here, it makes it a lot easier to have that conversation and actually be able to point to things you've done. And if there's a reason that they're not able to make a modification to your compensation at that time, you can at least start having the conversation about what's it going to take to be able to get to that next level. Now, I have seen people do the thing where they go out and get an offer from another company and bring it back to use that to negotiate their current compensation up. I don't support that. I don't think that's the best way to go about it. I actually think that it can create some bad blood internally, even if they do end up coming back to you and trying to offer you more money. And then on top of that, the other thing that I found, and I've read this a couple of places too, is it's some studies somewhere between I think 20 and 40% of people who accept the counter offer from their company end up still leaving that company 6 months after the fact. Mm-hmm. And I think that companies know that as well. So if you're coming back to ask for more money, you then become a flight risk, even though they've given you what you want. Is that something you really want hanging over your head?
No, absolutely. So what about we go back and we're trying to negotiate for more? Say we do it during our review process because it's the appropriate time of year. I've talked at least with one person recently who came to me and said, I know that I'm doing a good job. I know that I'm saving more for the company than my coworkers. I'm smarter. I work harder. I'm better than everyone else, basically. And
yeah.
let's say that, even that person is right. And the person said to me, I want to go to my boss and ask for 50% more money. That's what makes sense to me. What would you say to that person?
Probably not going to happen. And especially so going back and saying that you work hard. So working hard is relative. Mm-hmm. It's relative to the individual. And thinking you're the best, you may be the best in the group. And maybe you're in sales where it's a lot easier to quantify who's actually at the top of the peer group. But if you're doing a lot of project work where there's not necessarily a monetary value, or it's not about a certain number of widgets or a certain number of people you've hired, how you see your value and what you're contributing could be different than how your peers and how your manager sees your value. You could think that you're a top performer, but you have a bad attitude, and it demoralizes people on the team. And maybe that's something a manager has never said to you, but that's something that's factoring into why you haven't received that raise. And again, it's likely that the change in compensation is going to happen during one of those cycles. And if you have that information and you can make that case and you can even say that you looked at some market data, I know that there's the pay scale and some of the other sites out there, and I imagine there's probably other things that you would recommend to people. If you have that data that proves your value, and then on top of that, you've also looked at the marketplace and you went back and shown that you're not getting your just due for the work that you're doing, it becomes an easier conversation, but it doesn't guarantee that you're going to see an increase. And especially in some industries like nonprofits where they're often more hand-tied in terms of what they can do on compensation, they're not going to be able to make any movement. And it's at least at that point in time. And it's the same thing with some of the larger and established companies. They have these predefined set periods where they review everything and they make compensation modifications. But outside of that, it's just more of a we'll take note of that. Let's reevaluate that again in a few months. And if that is what you get from the manager, you have to make sure that you hold them to that. Again, you can't let someone else take charge of your career. You can't let someone else take charge of sometimes it probably is good to have someone else take charge of your finances. But you need to make sure that you're the one who's pushing for that, and that if your manager is saying, let's talk about this in 3 months, there's a lot of stuff going on right now, to make sure that you do circle back with that person, because it's likely they're going to forget because they're going to be so busy with all of the other things that are going on a day-to-day basis.
No, that's really, really good feedback. And I think in this particular situation that I described, the person is very young. They're only just a few years out of college. And I think their more senior peers are making more money, probably because they've been at the organization longer. And I do think sometimes that makes a difference,
Yeah, well, the other thing that people don't think about, and I run into this a lot out here with the folks that I recruit, that despite Silicon Valley having a ton of people and a ton of companies, it's still a really small world out here. And I get people who will say, well, I know so-and-so who has the same years of experience as me and they make X, or I know you just hired this person and they were able to come in at this. But what people don't know is how that person's interview went versus how your interview went. Mm-hmm. So you may think that you crushed it and that you deserve the most supreme of dollars, but maybe you were the B-plus candidate. Mm-hmm. Whereas the other person came in, did an excellent job, was loved by all, and was identified as someone that could quickly become a top performer. Now, I don't say that to say that whoever this happens to sucks or anything like that, but that's something to think about when you try to make those comparisons to where other people are and what other people are doing. You don't always have the full details of that person's situation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, absolutely. So this kind of leads us into another question, which is when we negotiate for a new job at a new company, I think that's where there's probably more room for sort of bumping up how much money that you make. But a lot of folks I talk to feel really nervous about the whole process of negotiation, the thought of starting it. Just the whole thing is really can be anxiety, producing. What thoughts do you have about negotiating for a new job? Should we be doing it? And if we should, how? What should we do?
Yeah, I definitely think that you should negotiate, but I don't believe in negotiating for the sake of negotiating. So let's say you put in your salary info and they come back with something way stronger and you're really happy with it, or maybe you've already had one round of exchange and they got you what you want, and then you go, oh, wait, let me see if I can get a little bit more. That's not the way to go about it. Mm-hmm. And I think one thing I want to point out is that I don't think people understand how much money they probably cost themselves over the years by not negotiating. So that first salary you negotiate or that next salary you negotiate potentially determines where you're going to land in the next role and in the next role. So when you don't take that step to negotiate, especially when you know that what you should be receiving is more than what the company is offering, you're not just setting yourself back in the current, you're also setting yourself back for years going forward. Now, one thing, it's interesting because I have a couple of different perspectives on this, having worked for a nonprofit, having worked for a staffing agency, having worked for a startup, and now having worked for a large established company. But so I'll start with this side of it, and recruiters are going to hate me for this.
Great.
But I actually tell people not to share salary up front if possible.
I do too, so tell it. Yeah. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. So you can say you want to understand more about the role and the expectations, and that's fair because sometimes what level you'll be coming into the organization at, those types of things aren't decided until later on in the process. And so it's fair that you want to understand more before talking about numbers. And it's possible that your current compensation, you may know that you're underpaid. And for myself, for an example, I worked at a nonprofit for 3 years, not realizing that I was falling behind in the market. And so when I got a salary increase to go to my next job, it felt like a huge number. But looking back and knowing what I know now, I probably could have asked for a lot more at that time and gotten that, and the company wouldn't have blinked at it. But in terms of not sharing that information, I run into people all the time where they won't share information with me, and I get it. It's frustrating, but I understand where they're coming from. It's not something that makes me say this is a bad candidate or we don't want to work with this person. This person doesn't want to tell me everything about their financial life. And if a company really presses for that salary info, what I tell people to do, if you have to say something, give a range, don't just say a number. And if you're going to give a range, that range should start above what your true minimum is, which is something you really need to give thought about. Because when you take the range approach, it's kind of a mental trick in a way. The lower end of that range becomes the starting point versus when you say a number, so you say, I want, 60K, and then the company tries to meet you in the middle, versus when you say, I'm looking for something that's 70 to 80K or 80 to 100K, then the company thinks, okay, to even have a shot at getting this person, we're going to have to pay them at least this much. So that's probably one of the bigger things I tell people. The other thing is to also think about the full compensation package. So you'll get people who think a lot about base. I have a lot of conversations with candidates around base salary, but they don't maybe think as much about the annual performance bonus. Or and in the case of the company that I work for, they don't think as much about the stock and the equity package or the vacation time. Or for folks with families, there's a survivor benefit where the company will pay a certain amount of money over years to the spouse and to the kids if the employee happens to become deceased, which is not the most fun thing. But there's things like that people should also look at when they're negotiating. So maybe the company says, hey, we're completely fixed here on salary. This is the best that we can do there. And well, let's say it's a startup. Well, do you guys have any room to do any more on the equity? It'd be great if I could get something like this. And it's going to require research up front, especially if you're interviewing with an organization at that stage. But if they can't do anything on the base salary, there may be wiggle room for them to do things in other areas, but you just need to ask for it.
That makes a lot of sense. So what about, say you're the recruiter, right, and you give an offer to a candidate and the candidate asks for a little bit more money. Usually the recruiter will say something like, I need to check on some things. I need to get back with you. When you get off the phone with the candidate, then what happens? Like, do you go to the hiring manager? Who do you talk to?
Well, it's interesting now. So I work for the internet, basically. And we have a compensation team that we do work with. So when I hang up the phone, I don't just sit there for 10 minutes and call the person back and say, good news. I actually do have, and I know that's what a lot of recruiters do, and that's what salespeople do too. Oh, I was able to get this special thing approved when they just had that information all along. But I do have to go back to a compensation team that looks at market data and is focused on making sure that there's pay equity, pay parity with internal folks, and also focusing on making sure that we're paying the market rate and the market wage for what that skill set would demand versus trying to go crazy to attract any one individual. And so we do have a compensation philosophy where there are guidelines that we need to stay within. And so when someone's asking for more and they don't have any additional information to provide to substantiate why we should go higher than that, I'm probably not going to get something like that approved. But if the person has a competing offer or they have some other situation or something else that speaks to income that they may be foregoing by accepting the offer, those are things that I can take back to the compensation team and say, hey, here's this person's situation. Here's a more accurate snapshot. Here's some data to back up where they are and work on getting the compensation requested. Now, that's something that's probably more common with the larger and established companies that actually have a compensation team and they have a set system and set guidelines that they won't go out of. For other companies that maybe aren't as mature, it's usually going back to either someone else in HR or someone else in the finance department. So when I was at a startup, I would have to go to the director of HR and to the chief financial officer for compensation modifications. It's rare that I've had to go back to the hiring manager. If anything, I'm going back to the hiring manager and saying, hey, here's where we are with this person. Here's what they're asking for. I'm going to go work with HR. I'm going to go work with finance on this unless you object. Mm-hmm. And then the hiring manager will say, okay, yeah, that's fine. Or that really doesn't jive with where this person would be coming in compared to everyone else on the team. I don't want to go that high. Let's make this our final offer. So I guess in that case, the manager does have some input, but in terms of the actual numbers, that's usually with somebody in one of the operations functions.
That's interesting. So I have one more question about this whole process, and that is, so for example, there's a big company here in Memphis where I'm located that there are pay bands for different, levels of jobs, right? And a candidate can go in and interview and know that they fall within the pay band, that the salary that they need, it is possible within this pay band. And then it can turn out, the hiring manager can love this person, everything can be great, and it can turn out that the hiring manager makes less than the candidate. And so even though the company in theory could pay the candidate enough to get them, they would have to pay the candidate more than their own manager. Do you ever come across that situation?
Yeah, I've come across it a few times, and the compensation team or the CFO, whoever made that decision, did not okay going above it, because that creates issues too.
Right, yeah.
Because then you have somebody who's on the team making more than the manager. The manager may become disgruntled about that over time, could become resentful about it. And I've seen unfortunate situations where even a little bit of the ego comes into play,
right?
Where the manager is thinking about it, and then they maybe decide not to go forward with the person, or that person maybe does somehow end up getting through, and then the manager ends up leaving the company a few months later, or they're in conversations about the same thing. So it's very hard in that case, and that's one of when we talk about those specific guidelines and somebody falling within the range and looking at internal pay equity, those are the type of things that a compensation team or a finance person will have to look at. And a lot of times to bring if someone's going to be making more than the manager, they better be the best of the best, or they may be coming from somewhere where they have a really aggressive compensation package, and maybe it's a situation where we get close, but in terms of that person coming in way above the manager, that's not something that I typically see happen.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. The situation I'm describing, the manager had actually been at this big company for 10 or 15 years, probably getting 2 and 3% a year raise. And so I think the manager was actually probably kind of underpaid themselves, and maybe they didn't realize it, So anyway, that's just an interesting little scenario. But
so related to that, though, that happens when you stay at a company for a long time. You typically, you're going to see smaller increases unless you get a promotion,
right?
Versus someone who's maybe switching. I'm not saying you should change jobs every 2 years, but when the best way to see the most significant increases is to get a new job. So, if you've been at the same company for a while, that's something to pay attention to. So, like even for example, with myself at the nonprofit, I was happily there, was enjoying my time with the company, was getting the small nominal annual increases that basically just kept up with the cost of living. But during that same time, my peer group, they're getting new jobs, they're going to publicly or publicly traded or private companies, and they're seeing those increases while I'm just going up, maybe a percentage or two every year. So if you're working somewhere and you've been there for a while, that's something to think about, to go look at the market, and maybe you go back and have that conversation about about why you should be paid more, because you've looked out there and you realize that your skill set now is actually worth X. And at one of my previous companies, they actually did equity adjustments where they would periodically look at compensation of folks across the organization. And if somebody had really fallen behind the market rate, they would do an equity adjustment on their compensation package to bring them up, to bring them in line with where the market is. Now, every company may not just generously do that. This company happened to take that approach, but I don't think it's surprising if someone's been with the company 5 or 6 years and they've pretty much just had 1, 2, 3% increases to come back and say, hey, I've been here for a long time, really enjoying my experience here, was doing a little bit of research, and the role that I'm doing, if I look at it in the open market, is paying somewhere between X and X. And to start having that conversation about if there's a way to make that type of modification. Now, again, they may say, let's wait till the mid-year or let's wait till the end of the year, but it's a fair point to raise that I don't think that they'd be surprised by.
No, absolutely. I think it's an interesting point that you raise. I think it was Forbes that wrote an article last year that said, on average, if you stay at a company more than 2 years, on average, that you make like 50% less over the lifetime of your career, something like that. And, it's interesting, the folks that I know who make the most money are the ones who have the least sort of loyalty to one particular company. And it's not that they're disloyal or that they don't do a good job while they're there, but they're not afraid to change jobs. And I think they understand how the game works versus it's very, very often that I will talk to someone that will say, I've been at the company 5 years and I'm going to give it 2 more years of really hard work. And I hope that they're going to recognize my value. I'm going to show them that I'm worth it. And I just want to say that's just not how the game works. Like, even if they like you, even if they think you're awesome, they may not have the ability to pay you what they could pay someone from the outside. And I think it's coming to that realization that it's a system, it's a game that you're kind of playing and that you're participating in. It's not personal in the way that it feels.
Yeah, and that's definitely true. And I've seen people who have moved every 2 years, and to me, it's funny because there was a day where that was a red flag. Mm-hmm. If someone moved every 2 years, it was like, oh, this person's a job hopper. But now that's pretty normal to see someone do that. And I read an article, I don't think it was on Forbes, but it was an article about how we're now even starting to see managers who are starting to move from companies sooner. So previously, managers would stick around a lot longer, but we're starting to see managers who are starting to leave companies after every 2 to 3 years, because maybe they want to work on something new, but then they also know that that's going to increase their earning potential. And it's interesting to me because I'm like, there's this person who's bouncing from place to place. They seem to be able to have no problem finding a job, and they just keep pushing their compensation up and up and up. And because that person is good, the managers or whoever else, nobody really bats an eye at the fact that the person is pretty much on schedule to move every 2 years.
Right. No, totally. I think the other thing, though, from the candidate side on that I think about once in a while is in the past, when we were expected to stay at a company for 10 years or whatever, the company would often invest in things like training, and they'd send you back to school and they'd help you with all this stuff. My personal perspective is that when you're doing that jumping every 2 years, that you ought to be ready to invest some in yourself and your own education and going to conferences or whatever, and not necessarily have the same expectation that the company's going to always be paying for you to do that stuff. Because I feel like the company expects you to come in and be a rock star for 2 years, knowing that that's how long they're going to get you.
Yeah, and a lot of companies have done away with a lot of the tuition assistance type of stuff from people that I've talked to, or there's a lot more requirements tied to it. So you need to have been with the company for a certain amount of time, and then beyond that, you need to stay for another amount of time. It's almost like going into the Army or something.
Right.
Otherwise, you have to pay the company back. So going from gig to gig and just expecting that everything's going to be rolled out for you and you're going to have all of this stuff granted to you just because you're you, that attitude is probably not going to benefit you in the long term. And people also have to be careful with how they're communicating their expectations, because I've seen people who have over-negotiated. I'm not sure if you've had clients like this where someone essentially over-negotiates, and they become so nitpicky that the company says, you know what, if this is how this person handles negotiation with us, imagine how this person is going to negotiate on our behalf. This isn't someone that we want to have on the team.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. It's really important that you keep in mind the relationship that you're creating with the company when you do that negotiation.
Yeah. And there are people that I've had who've been really tough negotiators who maybe didn't leave the best taste in my mouth, but they came on board and they were incredibly sharp performers. And I think what I realized from those people is that they really knew their value and they stuck to it.
Mm-hmm.
And because they were good at what they did, and they had other things that were going on, they were able to do that more than maybe some other folks who maybe this is the only job they're interviewing for, or maybe they're at the point that they hate their job, they're desperate to get out, and they're ready to take the first thing that they can get. And so they just sign the offer and just go on about it, and that's the end of it.
Yeah. Yeah, you definitely want to be looking for a job before you're ready to run out of the building.
Yeah,
for
and
sure.
I think people probably cost themselves money that way too.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to what we were just talking about, where if you're waiting to the point that you're fed up, you hate your manager, you hate going to work every day, and you are looking at an outside opportunity and you get an offer and you're like, I don't want to mess this up. It's the one opportunity that I have to get out of here.
Yeah.
You're probably going to end up not negotiating as much or not coming in at the compensation that you should have because you were just so desperate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Well, so another thing I'd love to get your perspective on, because I talk with clients and just people in general about this all the time, especially, so Memphis in particular, and, I talk to people in lots of cities, but in Memphis, we have one of the lowest cost of livings in the entire U.S., and we actually don't even have state income tax. So on top of it being cheap, you don't have to pay as much in tax. So anyway, I talk to clients a lot who are interested to move to California, for example, and I know you've lived kind of in a few different places around the U.S., and oftentimes they'll say to me, well, I know that if I move to California, they're going to pay me enough so that I can have the same quality of life that I have here in Memphis. And here in Memphis, they may have a big house with 4 bedrooms and, a 3-car garage or something like that. From your perspective, how does that work in terms of adjusting pay, taking into account cost of living? Does it really happen like that?
Yeah, so I think that cost of living is definitely taken into account. So in my situation, I was previously in New York City before I moved to the Bay Area, and I got my offer and I looked at it and I was like, this is great. This is an awesome number. Like, sure, I love it. I'm coming out there. Like, oh man, I'm going to be in such a great place financially. I'm going to be balling, buying cars, all of this other stuff. And then I got out here and experienced the cost of living. So, for example, when I lived in New York City, I didn't have to drive or spend money on gas because I could just take the subway every day.
Mm-hmm.
Rent, surprisingly, was a lot cheaper for me in New York City than it was in California.
Mm-hmm.
And so those were things that I probably could have thought a little bit more about, and that people should think about when they're relocating. So you may get an offer, and it sounds like a great number, but you're comparing it to where you are now. So let's say it's you're in Memphis and you get a job in the Bay Area and it pays $100K. That's probably going to sound like a lot of money. Mm-hmm. But then when you get out here and you realize that what you would get for a house or what you would get in terms of the size of your apartment is going to be much smaller, that can be pretty jarring. Mm-hmm. So people want to make sure that they're thinking about that as well. Now, in terms of companies relocating people, that does happen, especially with the more established companies. We have teams that are dedicated to helping people relocate and different packages and all of this other stuff. So that does happen. And we do try to bring people in at a market rate for the area, but we don't say, okay, because this person has this gigantic house and these 3 cars and all of these other things on their current income, we need to pay them that much more to come out here. No, we're going to pay that person the market rate for this area. We're going to do some things to help this person get out here in terms of travel and reimbursement, but we're not going to give them plus 15% in their compensation so that they can have the exact same standard of living that they're having wherever they're based at currently.
So I agree. And you said something really really, really important there, which is that you pay them what's the market rate in your area. So just as a contrast, for example, when I got into digital marketing 10 years ago and I was living in Memphis, there were some big companies here that needed digital marketers, but there were almost no digital marketers living here. And so they really had to pay a premium to find a good digital marketer because no one even wanted to move here because there's, if you decide you don't want your job, there's very few other options. So I think I came from LA to Memphis. I think I probably was paid more in Memphis than I would have been in LA simply because there were more people in LA to do the job, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, it definitely makes sense. It's all about supply and demand, and that ties to the market rate, and that can push the market rate up. And especially out here, I think in the Bay Area, it's a good example. There aren't enough good software engineers. Okay. There's a bunch of software engineers, but there aren't enough. And that's why you'll see the people who've been with one company for several years, when they go out into the market, I'm seeing people who are getting 20, 25, 30% increases in compensation just by leaving their current company after having been there for a few years. So it would make sense that in Memphis, if that skill set isn't there, that a company is going to have to be more competitive or go above what may be the mean or whatever it is to actually bring somebody in to be able to do that job. So I could see that. I could definitely see that happening.
So I'm curious. I have a friend that works at another big .com in the Bay Area, and I asked him at one point how much rent was, and he's about 36 years old, really, really smart guy, multiple degrees, and he still has a roommate in order to mitigate the cost of the apartment that they live in. And I remember he shared with me how much the cost was, and then all of a sudden I realized that was his half. It seemed like a lot, even when I just knew his half. For like a 2-bedroom apartment, like what's the ballpark in the Bay Area? What would an average person be looking at for a 2-bedroom apartment out there?
Oh, if you want to live in a decent area, and that's a lot of different pockets, you could easily spend $3,000 a month on a 2-bedroom. I mean, in the city of San Francisco, you could spend $3,000 on a 1-bedroom. I work with people who are spending that much on rent, and it was shocking to me when I came out here because when I lived in New York, my rent was what, $1,500, $1,600 a month or something like that. And of course, when I lived in New York, it wasn't the greatest of areas, and had I lived somewhere else, I probably would have paid a little bit more. But when I came out here and saw that I was looking at something $2,500, $2,600 to live in a neighborhood, and not even the bougiest and most upper echelons of neighborhoods, but a neighborhood where I could feel safe and my fiance could feel safe and we could walk around, that we were going to have to spend $2,600. And then if you live in a one of the managed apartment communities, with the rent increases, our rent went up $300 after the first year, and then on our second year renewal, it went up another $250.
Wow.
So when you're dealing with that from year to year, it really does start to eat away at what can feel like extra money when you're making that transition, and you're like, great, I'm making this, I'm going to be able to do all of these different things. But a lot of people don't think about those annual rent increases. And so you move out here, and think about it for people now. They move out here, and let's say they're spending $3,000 on a 2-bedroom. To them, that's normal because that's their first experience with the Bay Area, and they're like, okay, that's just what I have to pay. But they don't think about the fact that next year they're going to be paying $3,250 or $3,300, and then the year after that, they're going to be paying $3,500 or $3,600 for that same unit. But if they haven't gotten a promotion or gotten a new job, their income is only going to have went up, a few percentage points. So
it's
something
intense
else for the people to think about.
Yeah, I think it's really smart. I think it's good to think about because I think so often it just sounds really fantastic. And of course, I encourage everyone to move there if they're interested, but I think you just have to be prepared. So my very last question for you is, I noticed, there's tons of jobs posted in the Bay Area, and, as we have listeners who are thinking about moving out there who really want to get a job, what kind of job seeker do you think would be the best fit at these different .com companies? Like, what kind of person should be considering this type of move?
Yeah, so one of the benefits for the more established.coms is that there are more people who naturally want to work there. So the talent pool that's available is higher, which means that companies can ask for more out of those same people. So I know a lot of the companies out here, they're really focused on relevant degrees. Maybe with some of the much smaller startups, you'll find a few that are a bit more flexible about that. But I know that the degree requirements or industry experience in lieu of, and when we talk about industry experience, if they're going to take someone that doesn't have a degree, it's usually someone who's maybe been doing it for like 15 or 20 years and has a proven track record working at other established companies and really helping, kind of build those organizations from the ground up, or really having a contribution that somehow impacts the bottom line or a product or a service. I'd say that the other thing is really being able to thrive in environments where there's a lot of ambiguity. Things are very fast-paced. I think that's just the nature of Silicon Valley, regardless of what company you're at. So I'm sure a lot of people at this point have heard about Yahoo and what's going on over there.
Yes.
And then, there's been things that have happened with Twitter. And then, of course, even within Google, there are a lot of transitions and changes that are happening that impact people throughout the organization. And not everyone is great at handling change or being able to really think on their feet. And I've seen for many of the positions that I've worked on, software engineering and non, we want someone who has a proven track record. We want someone who's going to be a team member. I think that gets underestimated a lot. And when you think about the cost of bringing somebody into the organization who may be a good performer but has a bad attitude and what that does for the team, we really look for people who not only have the technical skills, and by technical I don't just mean engineering, it could be in HR, it could be in whatever, and we look for people who are going to be good team members, they're going to bring a good attitude to the office on a day-to-day basis, someone that we're going to enjoy working with, and they're also going to be able to communicate cross-functionally. Now, some people are kind of really good at just kind of being at their desk and doing their role, but how about the impact that they can have when they're working across teams? When they're working across teams. Not everyone's good at that. Not everyone knows how to find the right person to ask for help for a particular project, or knows how to reach out to somebody for a collaboration that's ultimately going to improve a process or a system or make the company more profitable. So we often look for people who have those core skills, but then also have the soft skills. And it's typically those things you see on a job description that people kind of laugh at, like must have good writing and communication skills. Like, who doesn't have that? A lot of people.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and you'll find every company has its quirks out here in terms of what they look for in attitude. Where I'm at now, I basically working for the internet. I work at a company that was acquired that's pretty much a late stage startup at this time, and so it's still a very fast paced environment. We still have tons of goals and things that we're looking to achieve to get to where we know that we can go, and we need people who can really keep up with that pace. So if you're going from maybe a place where everything is super slow and it takes weeks to be able to get things done, that transition can sometimes be a little bit more difficult when you're going to a much faster paced company where things may be changing from 1 week to the next, and how you handle that and the resiliency you have, I'd say, is something else that's really important, because when things are constantly changing, that can get frustrating. Or when you're told you're going one direction and then 2 weeks later you're told you're going another direction, that can really be frustrating. And it takes a certain type of person to be able to roll with those changes and also be effective at the same time.
Yeah, I completely agree. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk today. The thing that I like about your advice the most is that it comes from a place of real experience. And I know that listeners are going to want to check out your podcast, Paychecks and Balances. Where can they go to do that?
Yeah, so you can check out the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, pretty much any other podcatcher out there, Google Play, Music. You can also visit our website at paychecksandbalances.com. And you can follow our Twitter account at PayBalances. So we share a lot of helpful articles that we find, thoughts that may come up throughout the day or throughout the week as it relates to work and money. And the website, paychecksandbalances.com, you'll be able to find all of our episodes, the archives, And you can also sign up for our newsletter, which we just launched this week, where we're taking the same fun-formative approach to work and money, but applying it to a newsletter format to share top articles we find, career advice, money management advice. And you can sign up for that directly by going to paychecksandbalances.com/email.
Awesome. Well, that's great. I know everybody's going to want to check that out.
Yeah.
Well, thanks everyone for listening. And thanks to those who sent me questions. You can send me your questions at angela@copelandcoaching.com. You can also send me questions via Twitter. I'm at Copeland Coach. And on Facebook, I'm Copeland Coaching. Don't forget to help me out. Subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher and leave me a review.
Thank you for listening to the Copeland Coaching Podcast today with your host, Angela Copeland. Tune in next time to get more great tips on turning your job search into a slam dunk.